Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast for Age Civil War. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and as a proud graduate of the University of Arkansas, I have the great honor, if you like, to have a graduate of Mississippi State University on today, and we're both in relatively gloomy weathers. Um, that has nothing to do with politics. So today, joining me from beautiful, maybe, I have never been there, Starksville in Mississippi is Ryan Semmes. He is, first of all, a graduate of the University of Mississippi's, sorry, they're going to kill me if I say that, of Mississippi State University. He got his PhD there in 2020, just as COVID reared its ugly face.
Hmm.
And yeah, I don't even want to know how your defense went.
It was actually, as we're recording this, it was 5 years ago to this day. And
Okay.
then I 2 weeks later the world shut down, or 3 weeks later the world shut down.
You had a
So
lot of time for revisions.
yeah.
And appropriately, he is the director of research at the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library, which is located at Mississippi State University. And we are talking about, yes, nothing else but Grant, the new book that Ryan just published with University of South Carolina Press, Exporting Reconstruction, Ulysses S. Grant and a New Empire of Liberty. So first of all, Ryan, thank you so much on this Friday to take the time to talk with me and give the listeners an opportunity to learn a bit about your work with regard to Grant.
Sure.
So obviously, when you started your dissertation research, you were not working at the Grant Library. But how did you
Well,
come to write about Grant?
so I sort of was working at the Grant Library. So I'm an archivist by training. And when I got to Mississippi State in 2007, I was working with our modern political collections. So senator and congressman's papers, governor's papers, things like that, mostly 20th century, a couple in 19th century, but mostly 20th and 21st century politicians. And then after about 2 years, the Grant collection moved from Southern Illinois University to Mississippi State University following the death of the longtime editor of the papers of Ulysses S. Grant, Dr. John Y. Simon. He died, and they hadn't quite finished the papers project. They were at about volume 30 out of what became 32 plus the memoirs. And so they moved the collection to Mississippi State. John Marzalek, Civil War historian, noted Sherman historian and biographer, he was here at Mississippi State, still here at Mississippi State in Starkville, and he took over as executive director. And they moved the Grant collection down into the same area where our political collections were, because the Grant collection is a political collection. And so my interest was always kind of early to mid 20th century politics, Southern politics. But I started as an archivist, I started working with the Grant Papers Project, and working with the collection to kind of get an idea of what we had, what were research copies, what were originals, so forth and so on. And in one of the file cabinets, I found a box that was full of the what I later discovered were the diaries of Orville E. Babcock, who was Grant's aide de camp during the latter part of the Civil War, his private secretary during the almost majority of his years in the White House. And in there were his war diaries, but were also these things that said first and second journey to Santo Domingo. And I started looking, and so I just started doing research and looking through a bunch of historians and biographies, and I learned about what was going on with Santo Domingo, and then I noticed that no one had used these diaries before. Um, Now, in the time that I started working on transcribing the diaries and organizing them for the collection, people came in and started to use them. So I'm not the first person to use them. Several folks have seen them since. But I really started to kind of get curious about this notion of American expansion during Grant's presidency. And so then about 2012, I foolishly, because I was on the tenure track as well, decided to enter the PhD program at the same time,
Mm,
but it worked out. And I decided, I'm really interested in maybe pursuing a look at kind of diplomatic history and international history
mm,
of this era.
mm,
Because as I looked through a lot of books on diplomatic history of the United States, you would see all this really great information up to about the Civil War. You
mm,
would see maybe a little bit about Santo Domingo, and then it would all just jump to the Spanish American War and the Philippines.
mm,
And I thought, surely there's things happening during Reconstruction other than Santo Domingo. And so I kind of got on, after taking a little short side trip on Grant's world tour, which I thought might be my focus, and looking at diplomacy during his world tour.
mm,
And then a book came out on that. And so then I kind of transitioned to something else. And so as I got through the process, I thought, okay, well, I really became fascinated with Hamilton Fish as Secretary of State,
mm,
someone who I'd never heard of and didn't really know a lot about. I was looking for biographies, and the last biography was written by Alan Nevins in
mm,
1939. And I thought, maybe and when you look at any modern history of Grant's presidency or biography of Grant, the footnotes are full of Alan
mm,
Nevins, right? Because it's a biography of Fish, but it's called The Inner Workings of the Grant Administration. And I thought I would feel like no other source would we trust something written by the 1930s, particularly by somebody from Columbia University who studied under Dunning and Dunningites. So much that people who study and write about Grant seem to really trust Alan Nevins even 80 years later. And as I started reading through it, I started realizing, that while not as blatant as Dunning, there's still a little bit of lost causiness, particularly in the idea that Alan Evans believes that Hamilton Fish is the savior of the Grant administration, and Grant is just kind of stumbling along and doing what Fish says. And as we have the Grant papers here and we read his letters and read Fish's diaries, you really see a more collaborative process between Grant and Fish.
mm,
So as I'm going on, I start, learning more about Grant, learning more about Reconstruction, and I start noticing that Grant has this belief system in who uh, who should be citizens under these new Reconstruction amendments, right? That prior to the Reconstruction amendments, only someone like Grant, a white man, landowner, or head of household, really kind of got to enjoy the blessings of liberty, right?
mm,
To citizenship. After Reconstruction, not only are African Americans enjoying this, but Grant, when he's looking at expanding, it's expanding into the Dominican Republic, expanding in the West, and all of these things. He's talking about incorporating the peoples who occupy those lands
mm,
as citizens of the United States. And as I looked more into it, I'm thinking, you know, that wasn't what anyone was doing before Grant, and it's certainly not what anyone is doing after Grant. Theodore Roosevelt doesn't care about making Panama, folks in Panama. McKinley doesn't care about making Cubans American citizens. Grant wants to make them citizens, wants to make those territories states, wants them to send representatives to the House and the Senate, elect governors, and all of these things to
mm,
participate in the process. And I thought that was really interesting. And as I looked more into Grant and who he was, I noticed that this is a very consistent idea of his,
mm,
not only for the freedmen, the African Americans, but for Dominicans, for Native Americans. Now, part of the problem is twofold. One, he A, doesn't ask any of these people if they're interested in being citizens. He just kind of assumes that they want to be, or he speaks to leaders who are in leadership positions who are interested. And two, he comes at it with a very Western civilization definition of what
mm,
a civilized citizen is. So for people who are Native American, they have to destroy their entire culture and
mm,
accept a more Western culture before they're ready to be citizens. But the problem being for Grant, or the problem for us as we look at Grant, is he has what he thinks is a prime example of that standing next to him at Appomattox, right? In Elias Parker, right? The
mm,
Seneca Native American engineer, former federal engineer, and who eventually becomes Grant's head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So he has this Native American man who is westernized
Mhm.
and civilized in his mind. And so he said, see, everyone can be like Parker, and Parker's great, right? And Parker was doing great before Grant was doing great, right? They meet in Galena because Parker's working for the federal government. So he's, been kind of accepted into the fold of the American bureaucracy for a long time. And Grant's like, see, everyone can do that. You just gotta, worship Christ and farm and wear the kind of pants that we want you to wear and send your kids to school and all of these things. And some Native
Mhm.
Americans say sure, but most of them say we're not interested in that. We are sovereign nations. So all of these things kind of start coming together, and I realized that all of these things are connected to Reconstruction, right? It's
Mhm.
not just about Reconstruction is not just about the southern states rejoining the Union, which it
Mhm.
is. B, the freedmen getting their rights, which it is. It's about then the reshaping of the Constitution and then applying those amendments to everyone who falls under the jurisdiction of the United States. And so that's kind of what led me then into my dissertation, which then transitioned into my book. So that's the very long answer as to how we got there. So
Good. No, and it gave a good introduction also to the grant papers, which is nice for
that's
those who are not familiar with how they got to Mississippi State of all places.
sure.
Um, but I kind of was there were two things that I want to kind of pick up on with regard to what you just said, and one of them is sort of the um kind of category, kind of the niche, the place of like what what do you see your book as? Is it sort of do you see it more in sort of I'm kind of like thinking in terms of like um no, I'm blanking. This is bad. Matthew Karp's book with regard to Southerners. Do you see it sort of like in that kind of a diplomatic history, or do you see it more as sort of a more transnational history, like for example, Greg Downes's work? Who do you feel like is kind of the closest to what you do?
Um, well, I tried to, the methodology that I kind of am jumping off of with it is based off of the Elliot West notion of the greater
Mhm.
Reconstruction, right? I'm
I
trying
was
to
gonna
look
go
at,
there next.
yeah, I was trying to look at Reconstruction outside
Yeah,
of that. Um, yeah, I would say that, Downs for sure. And oh gosh, yeah, names are escaping me at the moment. Hold on, I'm
it's
sorry.
Friday.
Yeah. Um, gosh, I can't believe I'm staring at my shelf too, trying to come up with some of the names. Yeah, but anyway, there's
Yeah, sort of the transnational reconstruction.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and folks like sorry, and folks like Don Doyle and you know uh, some of these folks who are looking at the Civil War era, but looking at like the kind of international implications of the Civil War era, right?
Mhm.
And there's a lot of really good stuff on the Civil War and
Right.
the international implications of the Civil War, and a little less so on Reconstruction. And so I thought I fit into a really, it fits into a nice niche
Mhm.
of you have this. The war's over, Reconstruction is beginning, and most books on Reconstruction really focus on domestic policy, the violence towards
Mhm.
African Americans, the kind of expansion to the West. But at the same time, I think, and again, this is the benefit of looking through Hamilton Fish's papers and Hamilton Fish's diaries, which is one of my next projects, and looking at the way the United States following the Civil War is
Mhm.
kind of taking larger steps onto the international stage, right?
Mhm.
Or the way that the international world is kind of poking and prodding at the United States sometimes, or
Mhm.
at the very least feeling out their strength, right?
Mhm.
One of the biggest things that I kind of discovered. Well, so the first book I read in grad school when once I got back into grad school for the PhD program,
Mm,
one of the first books is Eric T.L. Love's Race Over Empire, right? And
mhm,
there's a whole chapter on Santo Domingo there, and it's a really good book.
mhm,
I like it a lot. But he and I have, I think, a few little just kind of disagreements on the way that things play out in
mhm,
Santo Domingo. And I mean, the fact of the matter is it doesn't happen, and Grant fails, and
mhm,
he didn't have the support of his Secretary of State, even though his Secretary of State did do what he was supposed to do as his Secretary of State, and all these things happen. But I think one of the main things that I saw, if you look at the the reasons why memo that Grant writes. And so in my book, I kind of go through this reasons why memo, and it develops into what I call the Grant doctrine, which I believe this memo it's not just a doctrine of, hey, Santo Domingo is a great place and we can, grow some oranges and some coffee, and then maybe Black people from the South will feel comfortable down there. And he does say that. But he also talks about it in an international context. He talks
mhm,
about how having an American territory and or state in the Caribbean puts the United States in a position to A, inform the region economically through trade, and B, puts the United States in a position of authority in the case of a military fight with a European power. And this doesn't come out of nowhere. This is all based on the Alabama claims and the kind of tension that's still boiling over from the Civil War between the United States and Great Britain, right? And at the same time, there's an insurrection or rebellion happening in Cuba, and there's turmoil back home in Spain. And so there's no real idea about what's going to happen with Cuba and Puerto Rico. There's no idea about, could the United States go to war with Great Britain? And if we did, he is concerned about that southern coast. Because if you were to, as he says, if you were to leave Texas and travel to New York by
mhm,
ship, you'd have to go through international waters, unless we then had a presence in the Caribbean and then we could protect our shipping. And I think a lot of historians say, well, it wasn't really serious. They weren't really going to go to war. And I've had historians tell me that. And to that, I say, it's serious enough that they worry about it, that he's worried about it, that the British are worried about it, that they take um, diplomatic and military actions about it.
mhm,
And that when when Hamilton Fish on Grant's behalf negotiates that peace and international arbitration, uh, it's so well received by the British that when Grant arrives on his world tour in Great Britain, the they call him the champion of peace, and they're not talking about the Civil War. They're talking about the international arbitration that found a
mhm,
peaceful solution between the United States and Great Britain, right? And they have these giant banners about peace and all of this, and it has nothing to do with our war here in the United States. It has to do with preventing a war between those two nations. And I think, I asked a question once of some international historians, and like when you go to Schaefer, if you're a 19th century person, you're at that one session, maybe two sessions, usually the first session or the last session. And then everything in
mhm.
between is Cold War, World War II, Cold War, and Vietnam, and then War on
Thank you
Terror.
for saying that.
Yeah, and then there's a couple of us that going, there's other diplomacy that happened in America or in the world. So you have your couple of sessions, and then in between. And I remember asking some international historians one time, I said, how do we study not just peace, but we study war a lot and we study
Mhm,
the diplomacy of war. How do we study the diplomacy of peace? How
mm,
do we study the fact that two nations are on the brink of war and then
mhm,
they don't?
right,
Everyone comes to an agreement. And this happens, I argue, twice during the Grant administration. It happens early on with the Alabama claims,
mhm,
where these things could have gone south very fast if a
mhm,
bunch of these, former Irish soldier Fenians continue
mhm,
to
Right.
ride up into Canada and cause trouble in Canada. And if Grant happened to look the other way,
Mhm.
if all, there's several things that happen between the United States and Great Britain. Fishermen or in Canada and Michigan are fighting each other all the time over fishing. They're fighting up in the Pacific Northwest about the boundaries. All of these things could have easily turned into an international incident. And Grant, and in particular Hamilton Fish, figure this out. And then in 1873, you have the Virginius affair, where the
Mhm.
Spanish take a hold of the Virginias, they capture the crew and the passengers, many of whom were not involved, were just riding to Cuba, and they end up executing a number of the crew members. And within a month and a half period, the United States goes from talk of war in the newspaper to Hamilton Fish negotiating a peace before Christmas. And this happens in what, October 31st, November 1st, something like that. And by Christmas, he's got it all ironed out. And the British are involved in that too because there were British citizens on the ship. But there are these two moments where they very easily could have slipped. Popular sentiment could have slipped towards war. And the Grant administration, in particular, Hamilton Fish, figures these things out.
Mhm.
And so part of why I wanted to write this book was to just focus a few things on the Grant administration and Fish's work during the administration that showed them doing things, some things that were successful and some things that were not successful
Mhm.
in the international sphere that kind of proves their mettle, right? And shows that maybe the fact that things were a bit more stable to the point where you could just have inter party arguments over expansion
Right.
that have no real effect on things in the long run is a good thing. Um,
Mhm.
and I, because it happens before his administration, I don't go into the France and Mexico and Grant, well, let's just leave some guns next to the Rio Grande and see if they're still there in the morning, that kind of thing. I don't get into all of that, but even that's another example of a European power kind of poking at and testing the United States following the Civil War to see, are they strong or are they weak? They certainly have a weak Navy, right? The Navy's basically been obliterated and it's all junk. Um, but the fact that they could call up a standing army whenever they needed to, I think was a bit of an eye opener for the world. And I think the French and the English and the Spanish are all kind of looking at that. And it helps to have a conservative like Hamilton Fish who says
Mhm.
war's the last, and a conservative president when it comes to war like Grant to say war is the last thing we want to do, so let's do everything we can before that.
Mhm.
And so part of my work and some of the articles I've written and in this book is looking at that relationship between Grant and Fish and these different little moments of them um, using that diplomacy to keep the United States out of war and to kind of keep the economic engine running and to keep the political sphere Republican and all of these types of things. So yeah.
Right. So many things. We might have to extend this into a 2 hour and more conversation. But I want to go back to Schaefer because I totally agree with what you said about
Yeah.
Schaefer, and it's been a reason why I've been uh, absent as a member for at this stage probably a decade. I've been there because it just didn't feel like a good community to be part of as a 19th century guy anymore.
Mm,
But I kind of was curious about this in another aspect because when we think of diplomatic history, usually we think of the United States working with other countries like Mexico
mm.
or Great Britain or France or whatever. What about Native Americans? Should we think, or let me phrase it this way, should diplomatic historians think more about relations with Native Americans as sovereign people and makes that part of the diplomatic narrative of the United States, especially in the 19th century?
For sure. I just remembered. Let me go back real quick. Um, Certainly, one of the people who's influenced a lot of my work the most is Jay Sexton.
Hmm.
Um, and he is a bright light at Schaefer because he's still there, pounding away
Yep.
at 19th century diplomacy and putting together sessions and being on those sessions as a moderator. And he's writing really good stuff that is cultural and economic and all that stuff. Um, and when we're looking at international history in this period, yes, I think that we should be looking at the United States relations with Native American groups in the West
Mm,
as sovereign nations. The weird and interesting thing that kind of is a stick in the spoke of it is in the Grant administration, during the Grant administration, is when the United States stops doing that, right?
mm,
Prior to the Grant administration, the United States all did deal with these Western native groups
mhm,
as nations, as they were, and got into, developed treaties with them. Didn't always stick to those treaties, but worked with them as sovereign nations.
mm,
During the Grant administration, Congress passes I can't remember the law's name now, but Congress passes a law that says we are no longer dealing with these nations as sovereign nations, but dealing with them as, essentially wards of the United States. And that becomes part of Grant's policy. Grant's
mhm,
peace policy then is to say, you're not sovereign nations. Those old ties that you have are not as important as your tie to being an American. And as Americans, our ties to the Constitution, right?
mhm,
And so for you to join us because you live in this land that the United States encompasses, you have to then sever your tie with your nation and then take up the modern democratic way of governing yourselves, of and in Western civilized way of comporting yourselves,
mhm,
and you then are no longer wards of this nation.
right,
You are citizens of this nation, as equal to any other man in this nation, right? Um, and so one of the complications that we have as historians of international relations is studying that turn,
mhm,
because on the one side of the federal government, the United States government, they are not foreign relations. This is a domestic issue.
right,
But on the side of the Native Americans, they have not agreed to this. They are asserting their
mhm,
uh, independent nation status. And that is then where the conflict, one of the aspects of the conflict that happens, right? The United States is bound by those treaties to keep
mhm,
white settlers out of the Dakotas, right? Where Lakota on Lakota land, they find all this gold, right? And then this gold rush happens. The United States is bound by treaty with an
mhm,
independent sovereign nation to keep their citizens out of that land. And when those citizens come to that land, rather than supporting the Native Americans, who they are legally required to, the United States Army ends up supporting the white settlers. And then, of course, this happens in the West, in like Texas and New Mexico. Um, there are all sorts of complications because the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, when the United States, after the Mexican American War, takes the ceded land from Mexico, all in prior to that in Mexico, all of those Native Americans were Mexican citizens. And
mhm,
then all of the people within that ceded land could either go back down to Mexico into the old Mexico, or stay in that ceded land and become American citizens. And everyone who is there agrees to it, but then everyone forgets about the Native Americans and they just ignores that aspect.
mhm,
Until the Grant administration, when the Secretary of the Interior is trying to figure out a way to implement Grant's path towards citizenship. And he says, well, actually, a number of these tribes in New Mexico and Arizona and Texas technically are already American citizens based on this treaty, but they have to sever their relations with their tribe or nation, right? And so there's complications there that it behooves us, and I need to do a better job of it myself as a historian of international relations, to say, okay, I need to then get a better understanding of the complicated relationship between the United States and these Native American
mhm,
nations who are sovereign until not until they say they're not, until the government says they're not,
right,
and then uses its force and its power to force them to let go of their sovereignty. So yeah, I think we need to think more about that, because this is something that's going to go, that would go all the way into the 20th century, right?
mhm, right,
And but then eventually, you know, uh, you know, the members of these Native American nations eventually become American citizens. again, whether they wanted to or not. And I think it's an interesting arc
Mhm.
of American international history or American diplomatic history.
Yeah. Uh, Hope some of the diplomatic historians listen, and maybe
Well,
there will be a
again, the
Schaefer panel on that one day.
yeah, maybe. Again, my book is kind of split in two halves. One is a
Yeah.
bit more of the international, and the second is the West,
Hmm.
where I look at the relationship between these Native American tribes, but also with immigrants coming into the West,
Hmm.
Chinese immigrants, African Americans exiting the South and moving to the West. I did have a section on Mormonism that I took out that I might have to make into an article sometime. And that's a whole complicated thing about a lot of people forget that when the Republican Party was founded, it was founded as an anti-slavery party and an
Anti-Mormon.
anti-polygamy party,
Yeah.
an anti-Mormon party.
Yeah.
And during Grant's administration, slavery is gone, but there's still one pillar of Republican Party politics that exists, and it's important for Grant to destroy Brigham Young and the Mormons if he can. At the very least, polygamy, but he would probably like to get Brigham Young in prison if he could. And there's a whole real interesting thing about Mormonism and the connection of Mormons and Native Americans and immigrants, and that I just kind of had to pull out because while interesting, it just had to kill the darling, and maybe one day make it into an article or leave it with people who really understand Mormonism a little bit better than I do, like someone like Benjamin Park or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. And sometimes that's just what happens in the editing process,
Yeah,
that something
sure.
just doesn't work anymore and you have to throw
Yeah.
it out. So that when you think of the book, and it was something that was very interesting in the way you organized, the first part was Cuba, Dominican Republic, and then the second part was the West and Native American policy. It did remind a lot, especially the second part, on like Elliot West's idea of greater Reconstruction.
Right.
And it almost felt a little bit like, oh, maybe considering the way Grant talked about Dominican Republic expansionism and all that, like maybe we should think of greater Reconstruction not just domestically, but also as a part of foreign policy here.
Right. And that's my hope, is that we can look at the greater Reconstruction, which is moving it beyond the South
Hmm.
generally to the West, which gets complicated because the man's name is West,
Yeah.
Elliot West. Is his capital or not? But yes, I think that we should also consider expansion, particularly to the Caribbean, expansion internationally, the annexation of Guam, the way that Grant, one of his major sort of international discussions is on the creation of a canal, right, across
Hmm.
the Isthmus of Darien, right? And he wants it to be in Nicaragua, not Panama. And he wants the United States to be a big part of building it and all of that. And so we need to look at, I think, when we talk about the Greater Reconstruction, we need to think about it beyond just moving out towards the Dakotas or Kansas
Hmm.
or whatever, but it's also the reconstruction of ideas, right?
Hmm.
And the greater reconstruction of ideas. Because one of the issues that you have, and Lucy Sawyer's book on the Irish Fenians is a good example of this. It's this idea that these immigrants who come to the United States before and during the American Civil War, and then during Reconstruction, are fighting in the American Civil War, Irish immigrants, German immigrants, and so forth, and Cubans. And then the war is over, and we say, here is the Republican experiment. Now we have passed these new laws. Everyone is equal, everyone is free, everyone has the right to vote. And then they go, it's not like that in Ireland. It's not like that in Germany. It's not like that in
Hmm.
Cuba. I'm going to go home. And then they go home
Hmm.
and foster little rebellions there, or in Cuba's sake, in Cuba's example, a big rebellion, right? They're taking the ideas of American liberty that grow from the Civil War and mature in Reconstruction and taking them with them around the world, right? Even Chinese immigrants, right? Chinese immigrants who are sent to Cuba or to basically Louisiana, many of them are, they use the pejorative term coolie,
Mhm.
and are essentially slaves, enslaved. Many of them who are working on the railroads in California are essentially enslaved.
Right.
And what the Grant administration is trying to do is trying to curtail that
Mhm.
trade of
Right.
human beings and to then maybe not make them citizens, right? There's a limit as to who gets to be a citizen, but at the very least allow them to come to the United States and experience the economic blessings and all these things without, being treated like slaves. Um, and so those same people would go back to China and go, in America, you could do this, you
Right.
could do that, you can do this, you can do that, and kind of try to then buck the system there in
Yeah.
China. Um, and so there's something really interesting about the era, and I think there's more to be discussed about the way that these the personal experiences of these immigrants who come to the United States and then go back home
Mhm.
um, uh, is a reflection of Reconstruction and an expansion of Reconstruction, or as I say, exporting Reconstruction from the United States through humans, not goods,
Mhm.
exporting those ideas from the United States back home to their home countries, where they hope to then foster, a kind of growing rebellion of ideas, right? And of course, it fails miserably in Ireland. Many of the Germans get just impressed back into the army for the Franco-Prussian War, and then that sets off what is a real
Mhm.
interesting constitutional argument and legal argument about international law and citizenship,
Mhm.
because an Irish American who served in the army, who has been naturalized as an American citizen, then he gets on a boat and is arrested as a Fenian. Whether he
Mhm.
was or he wasn't, he claims American citizenship and says, I am not a subject of the crown. I am no subject of Victoria. You cannot arrest me. I am an American citizen. And then it's up to the State Department and the Foreign Office in London to figure out a treaty that's going to say, okay, who of a British subject leaves and goes to the United States and then gets naturalized as a citizen, what are their rights when they come back?
Mhm.
And some of it is you've got to stay away for a certain number of years, or you can come back, but you can't stay for more than a year and a half. You can't have a job. And this is what happens in Cuba is there's several Cuban Americans who have been living in New York, fought in the Civil War, and they go back to Cuba, and that's fine. And then they take jobs with the Cuban, bureaucracy, and they take governmental jobs. And it's like, well, American citizens can't be
Right.
working for the Spanish government in Cuba, and so it complicates things. And so there's a really interesting, I think,
Mhm.
understudied field of international law that again Lucy Sawyer does a good job with the Fenians, but that I think really reflects the Cubans and the Germans and Chinese immigrants and African immigrants and stuff that I
Mhm.
think would be really interesting to see folks delve a little deeper into. So.
Yeah, I agree. Like all the naturalization treaties that are coming in the aftermath of the Civil War, right? That like
Yeah,
are
Bancroft
part
too.
of that. Yeah, Bancroft
Yeah,
in Berlin and um, London too, and like yeah, it's finally being done. Finally, sort of that recognition of um, yeah, the
yeah,
naturalization process.
right.
So I I feel we're still kind of on the edge of the book, but
Yeah.
there's one more thing that I kind of wanted to, or kind of it gets now into the book more, but uh, I looked through your bibliography, of course, very curious because I'm always curious who's getting cited, who's not getting cited, who are the books that I've missed. Um, and I was very glad to see Dissolving Tensions by Phil Myers was in your bibliography because I read his book and as he was preparing it, writing it, and gave him feedback. And I always remember this one statement that he sent me in that process where he found in I think it was Gladstone's diaries, this quote
Mhm.
that said, Fish was a wicked man. So how do you feel about Fish? Where do you disagree with sort of the Fish scholarship? How do you see him? I mean, you're a Grand Scholar and working at the
Yeah.
Grand Library, but where do you see
It,
Fish? He's kind of a quintessential guy here.
a fish is a wicked man.
Wicked man.
Huh.
That's what Gladstone said.
Okay. I think Fish is a shrewd uh,
Okay.
Secretary of State. Um, I think when you read his thoughts in his diaries,
Hmm.
he he understands and he really reads people really well.
Hmm.
He knows exactly what kind of person you are when you come through the door and you're
Right.
lobbying him for whatever it might be, whether it's the Spanish minister or
Hmm.
the Turkish minister or whoever it might be that comes through the door. Um, I think I think he's an a, I think he's very good at his job. He hated working in the job. He tries to resign every year, right? He doesn't want to do it, but he's the kind of guy who if he accepts the job, he does it really well.
Hmm.
I think he does a very good job of getting to know Grant. He's one of the
Right.
few people who doesn't really know Grant. They met the Peabody
Hmm.
board of trustees and things like that. He doesn't really know Grant. He gets to know him over those 8 years to the point that he can anticipate what Grant might say, and so then
Hmm.
he can offer him different solutions. But he's not the guy, the way that it comes off in Alan Nevins and then in many subsequent biographies of Grant and histories after that is that he's pushing Grant towards the answer that he wants Grant to give, right? To the answer
Hmm.
that Fish
Hmm.
has. And that's not it. What he's doing is he's presenting a number of cases to Grant, no matter what it be. And just because he's Secretary of State, he's in the cabinet and he's the leader of the cabinet. Back then, the Secretary of State is essentially head of the cabinet. So he's in these domestic policy discussions all the time, whether it's about Reconstruction in the South and violence in the South, whether it's about party politics in Indiana and Ohio. He's involved in all these conversations. And what he does is he explains to Grant what the legal ramifications of every issue is. He explains to Grant both sides of the issue, that whether
Hmm.
he agrees with it or not. And then he puts it to Grant, and Grant will ask his opinion. Then he will finally then give his actual opinion. And then when Grant makes a decision, if he doesn't like that decision, he still implements it.
Right.
So he when the guys from the Dominican Republic come, when Joseph Fabens comes to his office, and this is in sometime in like June or May of '69, and he says, "I got a deal for you. I'm here on behalf of the Dominicans, and we want to become a state." And his first thing is, who are you, and who elected you?
Hmm.
But he hears him out, and he says, I think this is a bad idea, but I will
Hmm.
present it at the cabinet meeting to the president. And he presents it to the president and he says, this is what the guy said. I don't think it'll pass Congress. I don't think it has the
Hmm.
support in the Senate. And I think it's a bad idea. And it's not what we should be focusing on. But here's the information. What do you want to do? And Grant says, I want to send somebody down. And so he goes, okay, great. So then he starts coming up with the idea of who he's going to send down there. And
Right.
the first person is a naval officer, and his ship has some issues, so he can't go. The second person is a scholar of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and a guy he can trust, but he gets really sick. And so he says, "Well, let's wait till he gets better." And Grant says, "No, I got to know now. I'm going to send Babcock, my personal secretary." And when you read these accounts, they say, and Hamilton Fish was shocked by this. He's not
Right.
shocked by this. He's not shocked by any of this. They've had these conversations. He's not surprised. He doesn't like it, but he still does it. And so he meets with Babcock. He gives him a bunch of instructions and says, you have no authority down there. Don't do anything. Problem is, Grant undermines that authority by saying, but have the president of the Dominican Republic write out what he wants. Just write a memo. There's nothing to it. It's just a memo. And it isn't, it's just a memo, but they write it to sound shockingly like a treaty when they write it down. But Fish is aware of all of this. These things come back. He's shocked by the way the Dominicans have written this memo. But he's not surprised that he came back with some kind of list of demands or questions from the Dominicans. None of this is surprising. All he says is, I don't really support this, but if you send this to Congress, I'll do what I have to do as Secretary of State to push the treaty through. And he does all of that. Um, and when it comes to recognizing belligerent status for the Cuban rebels,
Hmm.
in the early days, Grant has in one ear his good old friend John Rollins
Hmm.
from Galena, Illinois, the old pal of his, the
He was
foul
like
mouth.
chief of staff, right?
Yeah, he was his chief of staff in the army, his foul-mouthed lawyer, and the guy that kept Grant sober during the war, right? This teetotaling, foul-mouthed old man, young guy rather, and but he's dying of tuberculosis. And
Mhm.
on one side, but he really supports not only equality for African Americans, but he supports the rebellion in Cuba. He believes in this concept of liberty and revolution and throwing off the European, the yoke of European monarchy and all this kind of stuff. Uh, and he's like, we got to go down there and help them out. But Fish is a pragmatist, and Fish
Mhm.
says, that sounds great. And as Republicans, that does even make logical sense, except for one thing. We are suing the British for their meddling in our Civil War. If we start meddling in someone else's Civil War, we'll undermine that case and we won't get money that we desperately need. $15 million is what they end up getting for the destruction wrought by the Alabama and the Georgia and the
Mhm.
Shenandoah and all these other ships that were built by British shipbuilders in Liverpool and, kind of made their way into the hands of the Confederates, shockingly. I'm shocked that they're building ships for the Confederates. And he says, so we cannot get involved in Cuba in any way, shape, or form. Officially, we cannot recognize them as belligerents for that reason. And also, we can't recognize them because they can't recognize themselves. They don't have a governing body. They haven't taken enough land to be considered
Mhm.
a foe that's worthy of anything other than insurrection. And so he comes to it from a very legal standpoint
Mhm.
of and practical standpoint versus John Rawlins, who comes to it from a very ideological standpoint.
Mhm.
This is what we do as Republican men in a Republican, and the U.S. should be the leader of these things. And
Mhm.
he's not wrong; they should. But then he dies.
Mhm.
Rawlins dies, and from that point forward is about the time Rawlins dies. Grant then appoints Edwin Stanton to the Supreme Court, who
Mhm.
dies the next day. And then, in the matter of a few weeks, he's got, Rollins is no longer there, Stanton is no longer there, and he now has all this stuff. And that's when he writes his famous memorandum of reasons why Santo Domingo should
Mhm.
be annexed to the United States. And so then the next day, or a couple days later, is when he goes and takes that memo and takes those reasons,
Mhm.
which he has talked to Hamilton Fish about, to Charles Sumner, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And then that's when all hell breaks loose because he thinks Sumner is on his side. Sumner is not. They end up hating each other.
Mhm.
And then this bitter feud happens between the two of them. And so Fish is the kind of look, Fish is racist, as racist as any other white guy of that period, other than I guess Grant and John Rollins and Sumner is even a little more racist than you think he is,
Mhm.
especially when you look at some of the things he says in Eric T.L. Love's book. Um, there's a new book on Reconstruction out, and I just kind of always look to see what they say about Hamilton Fish, and he's mentioned one time, so it's very much a domestic Reconstruction book, which is fine. That's what the book is, but it does mention Hamilton Fish, and it just says Grant's racist Secretary of State, and I said, I mean that's fair. He's a little more than that, but it's fair. He is racist, for sure. But he also implements Grant's policies, right? But towards the end of Grant, as you get into Grant's second term, Grant trusts him so much that he lets him lead the Alabama Claims Commission
Mhm.
all, without any interference, just report back to me. He gives him complete control of the Virginius affair because this is happening at the same time that the Panic of 1873 is
Mhm.
happening. These two things are happening at once,
Right.
right? And that's where we can't deny the connections between the domestic and the international sphere.
Mhm.
This panic that's happening in the United States, which becomes an international panic, is happening at the same time that the Spanish are executing American and British citizens and subjects. And Grant's like, I have to handle this. I
Mhm.
trust you to handle that. And he does, like within
Right.
5 weeks, he achieves peace. So I think he's a very successful Secretary of State, uh,
Mhm.
even though there aren't these big tent pole wins, right? You didn't get the Dominican Republic.
Right.
In his mind, not getting the Dominican Republic was success. He was
Right.
dodged a bullet on that.
He maintained
Um,
peace, right? That's
Maintain
that's a big
peace, right?
one.
Because the moment that we take over, let's say the United States takes over the Dominican Republic with all that's happening in Cuba next door. The United States gets involved, gets drawn into that, whether it wants to or not. Then the Alabama claims gets undermined. They don't get the money from the
Mhm.
Alabama claims. Continued animosity, probably, with the British at that point. Um, and then, the fishermen always fighting on the Great Lakes, and guys fighting up in the Northwest, and then
You got to
you never
assume the
know what's going to
Dominicans are
happen.
going to fight back too, right? So,
Right. So, and then the Haitians, right? Because
yeah.
there's this fear that Grant wants the entire island of Hispaniola. His problem is he keeps referring to it as the island of San Domingo. And so Charles Sumner says, see, he's admitting it. He wants Haiti too. No, he's just bad at semantics. And I believe Grant because of his internal writings and kind of confidential letters. He very specifically says he's not interested in Haiti.
Mhm.
I don't think he cares about Haiti at all. Um, he's more interested in finding a fertile Caribbean territory where the
Mhm.
United States can actually divorce itself from importing goods made in Cuba,
Mhm.
which he believes, as a Republican, means the United States is still the number one supporter of slavery in the Western
Mhm.
Hemisphere, right? Because the majority of those goods from Cuba that are produced by the hands of the enslaved are going to the United States. And he thinks that if the United States can make those things for themselves, grow those things for themselves, then we are living up to our ideas as Republicans,
Mhm.
little r and big R Republicans. And by the way, it's a big territory with not a
Mhm.
lot of people. And if African Americans want to get the heck out of the South, leave behind this racism and violence that is still occurring from their former Confederates, this is a wonderful place to go. And so, one of the things, excuse me, one of the things I get a lot of pushback from in um, my book and articles that I've written about this notion of African Americans going to the Dominican Republic, that
Mhm.
Grant's looking for a safe zone. Um,
Mhm.
is a lot of people say, well, that's just colonialism, right? That's just what Lincoln
Mhm.
was doing, right? Sending them away. Well, my argument to that against that is, well, these people would have still been American citizens.
Mhm.
This is an American territory, and he hopes for the path to statehood, right? These Black Americans who leave the South and move to Dominica, whatever they would have called this territory or state, right, are still American citizens. They can still vote. They
Mhm.
can still send someone to the Senate and send someone to the House. They would have a governor. They would have all of these things, and they could do this thing that Martha Jones talks about in her book on the 14th Amendment on birthright citizenship. They have this freedom of locomotion, right? The freedom of movement that they didn't have in the antebellum period, during the
Mhm.
Civil War. The notion is that anyone who is a citizen of the United States can move freely amongst the territories of the United States
Mhm.
without being molested or kidnapped or captured or thrown in jail or any of these things. This was not a freedom that African American people, whether they were free or enslaved, really had before Reconstruction. And so it's not creating a colony and shipping all the Black Americans
Mhm.
down there. It's having a colony that he thinks Black Americans might want to go to if there's an exodus. And then some of it is very racialized, right? He thinks that, there's this notion of the Caribbean as this kind of biological racism, that the Caribbean is better for Black people than it is for white people, stuff like that. But he's actually right, because there is a mass exodus. There are two mass exoduses that occur of African Americans from the South. And he's right. He knows this will happen. And he says it in the memo. He says at some point the violence is going to be so bad, we're not going to be able to prevent it. And Black people are going to want to leave. We're going to
Mhm.
try to, hopefully that's not going to happen, but they're going to try to leave. In the late 1870s, a number of them moved to Kansas and the West. And then the biggest one is what we call the Great Migration. African Americans leave in
Mhm.
the hundreds of thousands and go north, right? In the late 19th, early 20th century
Mhm.
because of Jim Crow. because of the violence against them, because of the redemption of these former Confederates and these
Mhm.
racists taking over. And so African Americans get the hell out of the South, which is
Yeah.
exactly what he said would happen. Now, Frederick Douglass makes the good argument when talking about the Kansas Exodus that he's against the Exodus because we should fix the South.
Mhm.
You know, these people shouldn't have to leave their homes. What they should is feel safe, and we should create a place for them to be safe, not say, we'll move somewhere that's safer. No, you should fix where they already are. But that's not happening. And Grant sees it as he kind of agrees with that, but he also sees that as a difficult task. And so he goes, if people are going to leave, here's a nice place to go. Would you rather be in Dominica than Detroit
Right.
or, you know, somewhere in Kansas, you know? But, and so I always get, when I get pushback on that, my argument and my reply is he's viewing a great migration. He
Mhm.
sees a great migration coming and he thinks this is one territory amongst many. You can go to Detroit and Chicago if you want to, but you can also maybe go down to Dominica where there's all this free land, all this land that a
Mhm.
man can get, becomes a landowner, which is what the dream is for an American citizen. And he grows his own thing and he builds his own stuff and blah, blah, blah. And I think so. Part of my job with the book, hopefully, is to convey that, to push back at that narrative that the Santo Domingo idea and his idea of Black Americans moving there is not just Lincolnian
Mhm.
Lincolnian colonialism, right?
Mhm.
Send them back. No, these are American citizens who are in America.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes we forget that if it's not attached to the lower 48, it's not America, right? Puerto Rico is America. Guam is America. Hawaii is America. You know, the Dominica would have been America. You were American if you were there. And we're part of the United States of America, I should say. Um, and so that my hope, that part of the book is my hope is that I can kind of push back on that because you see he's very present sometimes. He really does kind of see some moves that happen in the future. He does it with the when he's on his world tour and he listens to slash negotiates a peace between the Japanese and the Chinese over the Lushu or the Ryukyu Islands, right?
Mhm.
And he basically says, look, if you guys start fighting over these islands amongst yourself, guess what's going to happen? The Russians are going to come down. The Germans are going to come over. The British are going to come over. They'll start seizing all these ports, blah, 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 blah. And he says all this and they agree. Yeah, that's probably true. These Europeans will take all these ports from
Mhm.
us and we'll start losing the ability to control trade. And
Mhm.
they agree and they don't fight. And then 25, 30 years later, they finally do start fighting each other.
Mhm.
And what happens is the Russians come down, the British come down, they start seizing all the ports and they lose control over trade. So he sometimes gets the bad rap of being, kind of an empty suit and not really understanding, but he is still a military man and he understands, he's able to see movements.
Mhm.
His problem is he naively trusts people, or he's very kind of paranoid and bitter,
Mhm.
and but all of those seem to be interpersonal. His
Mhm.
big problem is about interpersonal relations, but he does see big picture things a lot better than he gets credit for. He couldn't have won the war without that, right? That ability, right? But yeah, he's so petty and paranoid there towards the end, and it's just he can be really foolish, and it's really kind of disconcerting because he has really good
Mhm.
ideas and really good policies, and then he lets these interpersonal nonsense things get in the way a lot of times.
Which is a perfect lead over to somebody you already mentioned that he has a rather big interpersonal problem with, Charles Sumner.
Yeah.
And I kind of like it was a nice refresher on my mind because I kind of was waiting as I was reading through your book. I was like, oh, okay, when is it coming? When is it coming? Because I remember the kind of getting after Sumner and Sumner's sort of minions. One of the people that had to fall was John Rothrop Motley in
Yeah.
London, right? Like
Right.
he couldn't stay. He was the wrong guy. I mean, like I've researched him a little bit, and
Mhm.
I don't think Motley was ever a great diplomat, considering how easily people could sugarcoat him and kind of
Mhm.
get what they wanted out of him. But let's talk about Sumner and
Mhm.
like Did Fish see it coming? Like, I guess that's because you have this great story in the book of Grant walking over to Sumner's house and smoke cigars and talk about it and thinking, convinced him it's all good. And
Yeah.
did Fish warn him? Did Fish kind of like say, no,
No,
no?
Fish is surprised by all this because Fish knows him really well. Fish used to be in the
Okay.
Senate. They went on a trip to Europe together.
Hmm.
They knew each other really well. He kind of like, saw Sumner as a mentor.
Okay.
And then Fish becomes governor of New York and then eventually Secretary of State. And so he knows him well, and he thinks, okay, this will be great. We're two guys who know each other. We're both leading foreign
Hmm.
policy in our respective
Yeah.
branches of government. And so when Grant walks over to Fish's house, which was just across Lafayette Square there, which is now, I think, an IRS building, it doesn't exist anymore. And he knocks on the door. Fish is having a get together with a couple of other politicians and a couple of reporters. And they're all drinking and they're smoking cigars. And Grant goes in and smokes a cigar with them and tells him about this idea to annex the Dominican Republic as a territory with a path to statehood. And we don't know exactly what he talked about, but this is like a day after he wrote the memo. So odds are he talked about the things in the memo. And when he leaves, he feels like Sumner has agreed to support this in the Senate. Sumner says, I will, I'm a good Republican and I'll give it my best thoughts. And that's what most of the reporters in the room kind of say is what happened. But one of the reporters also says, he said he's a good Republican. He'd take a look at it, but you could get the sense that he was basically telling Grant, yes, I will support this in a way without coming out and saying it. And the other one was like, no, no, he didn't say that. So there's even differences of opinion, but you also have to remember they were, drunk. So
That much
so
drinking, huh?
yeah,
Thought
so
Grant didn't drink anymore.
well, Grant wasn't drinking with them, as far as I know. He just went over. He wasn't there long. Everyone says he wasn't there long, so I think he just smoked a cigar with them and then
Hmm.
left. Um, but they, so then he gets to the Senate and they send the treaty to the Senate, and he immediately comes out against it.
Hmm.
And again, his main thinking is that his argument is that Grant wants to take the entire island and wants to rip the sovereignty from the Haitians.
Hmm.
And for Sumner, that is a big thing. This is a black republic, earned
Hmm.
earned their freedom through blood and sacrifice.
Hmm.
And the United States does not need to be coming in and stealing Haiti from the Haitians. No matter how many times that the Grant administration says that's not what we want,
Hmm.
and the Grant administration says this wasn't our idea. The Dominicans came to us through their, you know, buddy Joseph Fabens, and the Dominican president Buenaventura Baez wants to be annexed.
Hmm.
But part of that is he has a significant group of people who are up against him. The Cabral regime, who Cabral and Baez are have kind of traded the presidency back and forth depending on who is in power. They've just thrown out the Spanish a few years before
Hmm.
for the second time, right? And so they're basically, Baez is like, if I want to keep my position as a leader here, I need support from another nation that can support me in case the Spanish come and can support me against the Cabral rebels, as he calls them, the Cabral regime. Uh, and Sumner knows all of this. And so he's like, look, this is just a political power play by the
Hmm.
Dominican leadership. The Dominican people are not interested. And this is just a play on Grant's part to take Haiti. And so Grant is like flabbergasted by all of this. And he takes it out on Sumner by saying, you know what? I'm tired of this. I'm supposed to, the Constitution doesn't give the Senate Foreign Relations Committee
Hmm.
chair the right to set foreign policy.
Hmm.
It's his job to advise on foreign policy, but he doesn't get to set it. And
Hmm.
Fish agrees with Grant. Fish in
Hmm.
his diary says, I don't understand where this is coming from. The only thing I can think of is either A, he wanted to be Secretary of State, Charles Sumner, and he
Hmm.
wasn't. Grant didn't name him. Or B, he thinks that he is actually in charge of American foreign policy
Hmm.
and not the presidency.
What do you
I
say?
think I think it's B. I mean, I don't think he really ever actually believed he would be Secretary of State with the Grant administration. I think that he thought he was in charge of foreign policy, and I thought that he thought he was a old lion of the Republican Party, and
Hmm.
that Grant should have run everything, including cabinet picks, uh, past him
Yeah.
first.
Yeah.
And Grant's like, it's not what the Constitution says, so I don't care. It's my job to do these things. And so because of that, he's very petty. There's
Mhm.
also an interperson, like a human element to this. Charles Sumner is a Northeastern Ivy League educated, famous orator and all of these things. And he looks at himself as an archetypal
Mhm.
New England Yankee, right? And then there's Grant, this Western, dirty old military man who reeks of cigars and, can only go to West Point because he couldn't afford to go anywhere else and
Mhm.
all these kinds of things. And for the reasons that Sumner hates Grant, Grant hates Sumner for those exact same reasons, right? He hates Sumner because he's this uptight, New
Mhm.
England, Harvard educated jerk.
Mhm.
Someone once said, a reporter once asked Grant, uh, did you hear that Charles Sumner says he doesn't believe in the Bible? And Grant replied, that's because Sumner didn't write it. Right? It's like he sees Sumner as this self-important man,
Yeah.
and he can't stand it.
Yeah.
And what you do with these important men in the Senate is you give important jobs, particularly in the foreign affairs offices,
Mhm.
to their friends, and you
Yes.
balance it out. I'm going to give a couple of jobs to someone from Massachusetts and a couple from New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, so forth and so on. And the best job in all of foreign policy
Mhm.
is the job in London. And they have given this job to Sumner's friend, John Lothrop Motley. And Motley gets the job. And like you said, he enjoys it a lot, but doesn't do a great job. And what Grant and then Fish even comes to believe is that he's doing more what Sumner tells him to do than
Mhm.
what Grant and Fish tell him to do. Fish doesn't see this as fireable. He just needs to have a conversation with him, which is
Mhm.
difficult because he's in London. So they do a lot of this via telegraph.
Mhm.
But he basically just says, you need to put, when I send you a directive, you need to put those before anyone else's opinion, including members of Congress who may be in contact with you. And he's not saying Sumner's name, but he's being very,
It's pretty
specific.
obvious.
And Motley says, no, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And then he does it again. And he does it again. And so, but Fish keeps telling Grant, let's not, like, we're trying to do this Alabama claims thing. We're trying to get some money here. Let's not fire this guy.
Mhm.
And Sumner is like, they're not going to fire my guy, blah, blah, blah. And then finally, Motley wrote, I think they published something in the newspaper that he said that goes against what
Mhm.
the American position in the Alabama claims. And Fish had actually sent him a telegram and said, we're going to stop talking about the Alabama claims for 6 months or so. We're going to just not even mention it because I think we need to just cool. We've got other things we're going to deal with. The British are happy with that too because they don't want to talk about it either. And then
Mhm.
Motley immediately goes and says something and it gets published in the newspaper. And so Fish goes to meet with Grant and he goes, yeah, we got to fire him. And so they fire him and Motley says, no, no, I'm not fired. I'm not leaving.
You're fired.
And they
You're
said, it
all.
doesn't matter, you're fired. And he writes this long memorandum about American and British relations, and he publishes it. And it really undermines the Grant administration. It really sounds like Charles Sumner may have written it, even if he didn't. It really sounds like the types of things Sumner would have said about Grant. And they immediately then, and they're trying to do this all behind the scenes. So immediately they leak it out that he's been fired. And so
Mhm.
now it's public and he has to go. Um, and Sumner is furious about
Mhm.
this. And so he, goes even more for full bore on being anti-annexation of the Dominican Republic. And he gives this really long speech in a closed session that has become known as the Naboth's Vineyard speech, where he accuses Grant of, again, once again, trying to steal Haiti, of supporting a veritable Ku Klux in the Caribbean, and all of these things. And he's not supporting Black people in America because he's wasting his time in the Caribbean and all these types of things. And then he says, and he sent this moron private secretary down who styled himself as the president's aide de camp. And what that came from was Grant sent Babcock with a letter of introduction to the president of the Dominican Republic. And he says, "This is Orville E. Babcock. He's a major in the Army, Corps of Engineers, and he is my private secretary. During the late war, he was my aide de camp." So he's trying to provide some context as to how long he's known him. And because of a problem with the translation between English to Spanish, when they write the memo, they refer to him as Orville E. Babcock, aide de camp to President of the United States. And Sumner goes off in Congress about this. They're just creating positions. I didn't know we had an aide de camp. Is he a dictator? Is he, and this thus then becomes one of his favorites, little scribes, is to call Grant a dictator and Caesar and all these things. And then eventually his little pal, Charles, Carl Schurz, who is a senator from, at this point, Missouri. He's a German immigrant who came. He fought in the war. He had represented Wisconsin in Congress, and then he moves to Missouri, and he's elected senator. He works with some of their colleagues, their fellow colleagues in the House, and they bring up an investigation of Babcock and the whole negotiations for Santo Domingo. And at one particular thing that I think is true, there are a couple things that they accuse Babcock of. Some of them are mostly true, some are not true, and some are. One thing that is true is there was an American citizen who the Dominicans imprisoned who supported the Cabral regime. He was imprisoned and then was sentenced to death, but they commuted it to banishment. But then they didn't let him out of jail. And so he keeps writing to the consul in Santo Domingo, and it's like, they won't let me out. They won't let me out. It's because I'm against Baez. And this is when Babcock is down there, and the consul asks Babcock what to do. And Babcock says, "I don't want any part of that. Leave him in there while with these negotiations. We can't have anything undermine the negotiations." That's a huge mistake. Then there's another American imprisoned who murdered a guy. And he goes to the consul, and the consul says to Babcock, "What do you think I should do?" And Babcock says, "Let him go." So they let a murderer go, but they let a political prisoner stay in there because he's against annexation. He's for the Cabral regime. That then gets found out. That guy, he eventually gets let out, and he goes to Congress and he testifies, and that sinks everything. Little also do we know that these two guys from Texas, Fabens and Casno, who are stylized as the representatives to the United States from the Dominicans, they offer Babcock a whole bunch of land. They say, if this, but it's all caveat, like he doesn't actually own the land. They say, if this goes through, there's this great little spot where we're selling some land and you could get some of that land at a good price. And Babcock in his diary goes to that spot and he says, if this all works out, this would be a great place for me to set up and make my fortune, leave the army and become a farmer, run a plantation or something. He never actually gets it. Then also the Baez, the Dominicans themselves, the Dominican government wants to give him land as well. And of course he finds that out. He's like, no, we can't do it. But it's the beginning of the corruption of Orville Babcock, who then becomes involved in one corruption deal after another, who starts gaining more and more control over who gets to see Grant and who does not get to see Grant. And all of these things are happening because Grant served in the army with him. So he trusts Babcock, and Babcock uses that to his advantage. But Sumner is aware of all this, and he calls Babcock up they call Babcock up to the committee in the House, and Sumner and Schurz are helping them come up with questions to ask and all this stuff. And Grant is furious because, and this is a weird thing about Grant, there are plenty of other people in his administration who get accused of scandals and get called to the House for an investigation. Elias Parker and the Bureau of Indian Affairs is one. But in Grant's mind, they are members of the cabinet. So that's their job. This is just what you do. You work for the executive. It's the job of Congress to bring the executive over and investigate things. Whether they're right or wrong, this is just what happens. So he doesn't really come out and overtly support these people one way or another. But Babcock is not an elected official or an appointed official. He's just a guy in the army who has been appointed to be secretary to the president in Grant's mind. So he's furious about this and he takes it personal. He takes this as this is Sumner. Sumner can't take a swing at me. So he's swinging at this poor young officer who works
Hmm.
for me, who's just doing what I asked him to do. And so he gets furious about that. So he stops giving out jobs to people that Sumner recommends. Sumner then shockingly in 1872 supports Horace Greeley. He aligns with the Liberal Republican Party, which is an offshoot of the Republican Party led by Carl Schurz, the senator from Missouri and Sumner's friend. He aligns with him, and they're avowedly racist Republicans. They don't care about equality for African Americans or anything. So Sumner is selling his African Americans out because of his feud with Grant. And in the middle of this are two people, Hamilton Fish and Frederick Douglass. Uh, Frederick Douglass, who's a huge supporter and old friend of Charles Sumner, gets appointed to a commission to go down to the Dominican Republic and just look at things. Congress sends a commission down there, and Sumner gets appointed as one of the secretaries of the commission. They wanted him to be one of the commissioners, and Charles Sumner complains about that bitterly that Douglass wasn't made a commissioner. But he goes down there, and when he gets down there, he comes back and says, I think we should do this. I think the Dominican people want it. I think it would be good for African Americans in this country. I think it would be good for the United States economically, politically, internationally, all the things Grant wants him to say. And Sumner says, are you out of your mind? And they have a split. And Douglass says, I then now looked at Sumner as one of the biggest foes to the Black race. And
Hmm.
so this great friendship that lasted through Sumner's, beating at the hand of Preston S. Brooks through the Civil War. These guys, are really good friends. They're abolitionists. They work together. Their relationship is destroyed because Douglass agrees with Grant over the annexation, and Sumner refuses to believe that it might be a good idea. In the meanwhile, Fish is consistently writing in his diary that he thinks Charles Sumner is going insane.
Hmm.
He thinks that maybe there's something wrong with him. We know that Sumner's relationship with his wife has fallen apart. He married this young woman, and he's down in Washington and she's in Boston, and she immediately starts stepping out on him with this other young man. And part of it is because he can't perform his husbandly duties, probably because of the injuries that he received at the hands of Preston S. Brooks, which is sad and shameful for him. But everyone knows this. It becomes common knowledge. In a letter, Orville Babcock is writing to someone, and he refers to Sumner as that sexless old fool, Charles Sumner. So, it's a common joke that he can't perform his husbandly duties, that his wife is cheating on him with this younger man. So he gets a divorce from her, right? And then he's just constantly like having these loud and crazed speeches and stuff. And so Fish really and truly believes that he is losing his mind, that he is going and saying, he says, this is not the man I've known. This man is completely different. Something is wrong with him, but I
Hmm.
can't support him. And so even though Fish doesn't support the Dominican annexation, he hates what Sumner is doing. He can't stand what's happening to Sumner. He's sad for Sumner. And Fish, who would normally be on Sumner's side in this argument, pushes his full
Hmm.
support behind Grant. He supports getting rid of Motley. He supports getting rid of some of these other Massachusetts people who are in these jobs and taking Sumner out. And so when Congress reconvenes in, I think, 1872, may have the date wrong, and they're about to reappoint the chairs to the committee. It's usually pro forma. They would reappoint Sumner as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Fish and Grant are able to convince their friends and leaders in Congress in the Senate to remove Sumner,
Hmm.
not just from his chairmanship, but from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee altogether. And he is never ahead of that committee again, and ends up dying in 1874, I guess. There, by the end, I think he and Douglass had gotten back together as friends because he was supporting the Civil Rights Bill, and he had written into it that in the Civil Rights Bill, not only should it affect African Americans, but he wanted to put Chinese immigrants in there as well. And uh, and that was something that Frederick Douglass supported. So there towards the end and at his death, Frederick Douglass and he, I think, had made up, but they had really gotten, along, really weren't getting along there for a while. So yeah, so all of this it stems from these sort of interpersonal fights, these personal dislikes of one another
Hmm.
that then go, and again, it's the Dominican Republic, it's the Alabama claims because it's Motley in London, it's Native Americans and it's African Americans and all of these things come together, and it's a very multifaceted discussion as to why these two guys hate each other. So
Right. Um, as sort of as we're getting long, I'm gonna give you one last question.
sure.
And since we've been circling around the Dominican, we'll just stick with that, and readers can read about the other parts of the book if they
Yeah,
are
buy the
now
book and read it.
fascinated.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, hypothetical, what would have had to happen for Grant to get the Dominican Republic? What's the key elements that went wrong that needed to go right for him to get it, in your
Sure.
opinion?
Well, he needed to be um, willing to compromise a little more.
Mm,
He
that's good.
he he was only willing to bring the Dominican Republic in as a territory with a
Mm,
path to statehood. The
mm,
first step that Fish told him, and when Fish first told him, he goes, "Oh, that's just from Charles Sumner. That's just some Charles Sumner nonsense." And Fish is like, "No, I'm saying this." Fish said, "We should first establish an American protectorate
mm,
around that region
mm,
where the Dominican Republic and any other satellite island that wants to fall under an American protectorate, we will be there to support their economic trade, to support them militarily, particularly with this rebellion going on in Cuba next door. Um, and in doing so, they should then allow Americans to move there and invest in all these kinds of things. And had they done that, they would have gotten support for that. He said, I actually have a number of senators who are willing to support a protectorate. And
okay.
Grant just refused
Right.
because I think he really believed that one of the things that I get into in the book is Grant has this notion of his administration, and in particular, the United States as a whole, needs to be the arbiter of freedom in the Western
Mhm,
Hemisphere. And in his mind, the only way to destroy slavery in Cuba and in Puerto Rico is by the United States being in the region
mhm,
in Santo Domingo.
mhm,
He says, because A, like I mentioned earlier, if the United States is growing all of its tropical goods itself in the
mhm,
Santo Domingo, then they don't need to import them from Cuba. If the United States is not importing goods from Cuba, then slavery will start dying in Cuba.
mhm,
And also, Cuba and the Dominican Republic are near one another, same with Puerto Rico, near enough that many of the enslaved there will flee and they'll
mhm,
come to the Dominican Republic
right.
for freedom. And when they come, we will then grant them citizenship. And then, also they'll be Republicans too, probably, right? And then we'll, get to vote as
Mhm,
Republicans. But once that happens, then they can look towards Brazil
mhm,
because Brazil then would be the last place where slavery still
mhm,
exists. And if that happens, then they have a free Western Hemisphere that no longer will eventually no longer have any European control in any way except for Canada. And and even that's, at this point, this is when Canada is getting some freedom from, British rule, basically. But uh yeah, whatever. But that's his hope. And the
mhm,
first step and the key to that is having an American state,
mhm,
territory slash state there. And he's like, we can't do that as a protectorate. We
mhm,
can't, you know, if the enslaved flee from Cuba to the Dominican Republic, we can't guarantee them the rights under our Constitution, particularly these new rights, these new Reconstruction rights
mhm,
that we have established under the Constitution. So if we can't do that, as a protectorate, then I would rather have it as a territory. Plus, I just want the land. It's good land, and the people want to be Americans. And there's not that many of them. I mean, it's a few 100,000 people. It's not a lot. It's too much for Sherman. It's too much for Fish
Mhm.
because most of them are not white.
Mhm.
And look, there's a lot of colorism as well here, right? Like there are Dominicans who are light-skinned Dominicans. There are Dominicans who are African Dominicans. There are Dominicans who are native Dominicans. This is the same thing in Cuba. Many of the Cuban Americans who we get citizenship in the United States are Spanish Cubans, so they have light
Mhm.
skin, and there's a lot of these things going on. Those things matter to other people. They don't ever come up in the conversation with Grant. He doesn't care. They're Dominicans, they're Dominicans, they get to be citizens. The only issue for him is gender, right? Whether they're male or female or sex. And so, this is the issue for him. And Fish is just saying, look, this will only work if we establish a protectorate. We're willing to give them support. We're
Mhm.
willing to be down there. We get to have a port there. That's what we want, a
Mhm.
coaling station, all of those things. But we don't take control. They're still a sovereign nation. We're just here to help them out. We're in the same
Mhm.
sphere of influence. And that would have passed. And Grant
Mhm.
says, no, that's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying
Mhm.
to establish um, territories that are run by the people who live there and are made up by those people. He does the same thing, just a quick teaser into the second half of the book. He does the same thing in Oklahoma, right?
Right.
Where there are Native Americans in Oklahoma, in Okmulgee, who he sends Elias Parker to help them develop a constitutional system
Mhm.
that would then establish that territory in Oklahoma as a Native American territory with a path to statehood.
Mhm.
And they send a constitution, a state constitution or a territorial constitution to Congress. And Congress votes it down. And according to that constitution, and what they established is everyone from the governor to the legislature to the senators and members of the House that they would eventually send are all Native American.
Mhm.
For Grant, the only people who shouldn't be Native American are the judges who are in charge of the
Mhm.
Supreme Court. This is a lesson from the Mormon territory
Mhm.
because he saw that when the Mormons have established a Mormon territory where everyone in charge is a Mormon, and that included the judges. And then when we arrest Brigham Young, well, shocker of all shocker, the Mormon judges and the Mormon juries won't, support his prosecution. So because of that, he says this is where, like, when it comes to the federal judiciary or the state judiciary, we can have control of that. But I think they need to establish a hierarchical government. One of the interesting things that Parker does is he tells the Native Americans, the Choctaw, Cherokee, and such, Chickasaw who are there in Okmulgee, he says, you already have a democratic government. You already have a hierarchical system of government. It's just about nomenclature. There's a really good book called, uh, um, oh gosh, what is it? It's a Crooked Paths to Allotment that talks about this by Gelatin Palala. And basically what Parker says is, look, instead of a chief, you call him a governor.
Mhm.
Instead of a warrior, you call him a sheriff. Instead of what a
Mhm.
council tribe, you call it the legislature. You have this system. It's just about making these white people, you know, using the words they understand. You've already got the structure there.
Mhm.
And he's right. They do. And so that's what they do. They create a constitution and they just use Western
Mhm.
democratic lexicon, but it's essentially the structure that already exists, right? And then Grant says, and then we, the federal government, will be in charge of, the courts.
Mhm.
And then Congress doesn't support it. He's wanting to do that same thing in the Dominican Republic, right? They already have a system. They have a Supreme Court, they have a legislature, they have a president, they have all these things.
Mhm.
The regular folks aren't as involved as they should be, but then they'll be citizens and they'll get to do that and be landowners and all that. Um, so he has these ideas and tries to implement it in Oklahoma, tries to implement it in the Dominican Republic because he sees the Western Hemisphere in the United States as this place where freedom can grow, where they can eradicate slavery, eradicate coolie immigration, eradicate all these things. And everyone who lives there is free, and the United States is at the center of it all. And the Europeans can stay in Europe and do whatever they do, but this is what's going to be happening here. And he's unwilling to come off of his ideas for that. When someone like Fish, who's very practical and pragmatic, says, I don't agree with this, but here's a way to get it done.
Mhm.
If you do it this way, it's a longer step. It takes a lot longer than your administration will probably even be, but it can get done in the long run if you're willing to do this. And Grant goes, no, I'm going to get it done right away. Heck, at one point he thinks about bringing them in as a state. you know,
That would have been
um,
something.
yeah. And look, he's not so power hungry for expansion. I think some people are like, oh, he just wants all these lands. At one point, when they're offering to negotiate between the Cuban rebels and the Spanish who are having their own problems in Spain, Queen Isabella's been, dethroned, and the generals are taking over.
Mhm.
The General Prim says to Dan Sickles, who is the Spanish minister, you know what? I'm tired of all this. What if we just sell you Cuba and Puerto Rico for like $5 million? If he was so power hungry for land and expansion, he could have eradicated slavery immediately that way. He could have taken that, but Grant says, no, we don't want to buy that land. We just want them to be free.
Yeah.
It's the same when Charles Sumner wants to take Canada, right, for
Mhm.
the Alabama claims. He's like, instead of paying us the $15 million, just give us Canada. And Grant's argument is, we only want people who want to join us. The Canadians don't want to join us. The Cubans don't want to join us, but the Dominicans do. So that's who I'm trying to annex. He thinks people should come to the kind of shining light of American liberty. And he thinks that the brighter that light shines, and the more places that light shines, more people will come. And, he's not wrong, but he's not successful. So,
Final question.
hmm?
What's more important? What's more needed? A Grant biography or a Fish biography?
A Fish biography for sure. I mean, there are excellent Grant biographies that have come out in the last few years. Some are very popular, some are very scholarly, some are very, particular on his younger life or his presidency or whatever. There's a lot of really great Grant scholarship. Um, Fish biography is really needed, because we do documentary editing here at the Grant Presidential Library. One of my projects is I'm working on it. I'm in the early stages of a documentary edition of Fish's Secretary of State diaries.
Nice.
And so we're, slowly working on that. No publisher or anything yet. We're just in the early days of getting it done. And, we haven't decided what format it'll be in, digital
Mhm.
or whatever. I'd love to write a biography of Fish that kind of could be used instead of Nevins's. And I'm also working on, and something I'm working on right now. Um, Lindsay Stravinsky did a really good book on Washington's cabinet,
Mhm.
called The Cabinet, and how it kind of sets the precedent for cabinets going forward.
Mhm.
And I think there's so much upheaval in Grant's cabinet that I think
Mhm.
there's an interesting book that
Cabinet
I'm looking into.
2.0.
Yeah, and just looking at Grant's cabinet
Yeah.
and how all of those changes and scandals and all those things affect Reconstruction.
Mhm.
And again, with Fish as the leader of the cabinet, and with his diaries as the kind of underpinning of the cabinet meeting minutes and what's going on. I think there's some interesting stuff out there.
Yeah.
If somebody wants to write a Fish biography before I do, I hope they do, because he's kind of guy that needs to. But I'm slowly working on it,
Yeah.
working my
Yeah.
way towards it. So
Cool. That will be fun.
yeah,
And there's a lot of what sometimes are called B-list characters that definitely need more attention, and he's one of those. Like, even
yeah,
though
he
he's probably
is.
more an A-list than a B-list.
Well, when people talk about who the best secretaries of state were, you get a lot of,
Mm.
Jefferson or John Quincy or whatever, or some of these 20th century guys who, I don't
Yeah.
pay as much attention to. Uh, but um,
They're all
but
meh.
I but again, and obviously Seward from this
Hmm.
era, Seward gets all of it. But there's a transition from Seward to Fish that
Hmm.
is interesting. because there are certain things that they both tackle, like the Alabama claims.
Hmm.
Seward unsuccessful, Fish successful.
Hmm.
There are certain things that they both tackle, like expansion. Seward is successful, Fish is unsuccessful.
Hmm.
So, you know, there are interesting kind of parallels between the 8 years of Seward and the 8 years of Fish
Hmm.
that I think, you know, a biography of Fish, because there are some really great biographies of Seward that are out there, like Walter Starr's and stuff, that I think a biography of Fish would kind of help complement that story
Hmm.
of international relations from 1861 to 77, that whole Civil War era. And yeah, it's those are projects that I wish I had the time to do them all, you know. I still got to answer reference questions. I'm a reference archivist, so I still have to answer reference questions every day and help my patrons
Hey,
find their research. And you know, that's my job, is to help other people with their research as much as my own. And I love doing it. So,
yeah,
but there's not enough hours in the day.
that I hear that a lot. I do hear that a lot, and I agree with it as well.
All right.
Well, and on that note, Ryan, thank you so much for taking such a long time for to talk about your book and
Sure.
Fish Grand, and in our case, Dominican expansion, but there's a lot more than Dominican expansion in the book.
Sure.
So if you are now interested in seeing more about international relations during the Grant administration, the book is Exporting Reconstruction, Ulysses S. Grant and a New Empire of Liberty with University of South Carolina Press.
Neat.
Thank you.
Right over my shoulder here.
Okay. For those that are viewing it, yes, it is also right there.